When David Johnson first laid eyes on the house, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. A black man who had worked his way from a childhood of scarcity to a career of stability, David had finally found the place where he could rest, rebuild, and give his family the life they deserved. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind he had only dreamed of when growing up in a small apartment with peeling paint and paper-thin walls. This house, with its wide porch, tall trees, and an acre of land that stretched out like a promise, was more than just property. It was dignity. It was recognition of every late night, every sacrifice, every battle against a world that often demanded more from him than it gave. But soon after moving in, David realized the neighborhood's homeowners association, the HOA, wasn't interested in celebrating his hard-earned victory. They saw him not as a neighbor but as an intrusion. The first letters came as polite reminders, written in legalistic tones, warning him about trivial details: the shade of his mailbox, the height of his grass, the color of the shutters. At first, he complied, thinking it was all part of the neighborhood standards. But soon, the letters multiplied, their language sharpened, and their intentions became clear. They weren't about order, they were about control. Every notice carried the weight of judgment. Every fine whispered the same message: you don't belong here. For David, who had fought his whole life for belonging, the sting was more than financial. It was personal. It was racial. The HOA had turned his dream home into a battlefield, but David wasn't about to surrender his dignity to those who saw his presence as a threat. The battles intensified. The HOA began nitpicking every detail of his property. They claimed his garden shed was a few inches too tall, though it had been approved in writing before construction. They complained about his children's basketball hoop, calling it unsightly, despite other families in the neighborhood having the same. They even argued over the plants he chose for his yard, suggesting his landscaping wasn't in harmony with the community's aesthetic. David knew what they meant. His presence, his family's laughter, his cultural pride, it wasn't their idea of harmony. The final blow came one morning when David found a notice taped to his front door. The HOA was threatening legal action. They claimed repeated violations, adding up to tens of thousands of dollars in fines. It was designed to break him financially, to push him out quietly. But what they underestimated was David's resolve. He had endured harsher challenges than this. He had grown up in a world where prejudice was spoken openly, where doors were slammed in his face simply because of his skin. This fight was nothing new, it was just dressed in paperwork and signatures. David reached out to attorneys, and what they uncovered was staggering. The HOA had been targeting him specifically, bending their own rules, ignoring similar violations from white neighbors, and weaponizing bylaws to force him out. The discrimination wasn't just imagined, it was systemic, deliberate, and malicious. For years, homeowners associations across America had been accused of these tactics, but few fought back. David decided he would not only fight, he would expose. He filed a lawsuit, not just for himself, but for every black family who had ever been made to feel like a trespasser in their own home. This was no longer about a mailbox or a basketball hoop. This was about dignity, justice, and reclaiming the right to belong. The courtroom became another kind of battlefield. On one side, David sat with quiet strength, his attorneys armed with evidence, witnesses, and a timeline of harassment so extensive it was undeniable. On the other, the HOA arrived with arrogance, convinced that their power and wealth would protect them. They had always believed rules were their shield, that the language of legality would mask the ugliness of their intent. But truth has a way of cutting through paper shields. Testimony after testimony revealed how David's neighbors had been spared for the same so-called violations. Photos showed identical sheds, basketball hoops, and gardens left untouched. Emails surfaced, some laced with coded language, others less subtle, exposing the hostility they held toward David and his family. The narrative of fairness crumbled under the weight of prejudice. As the trial unfolded, David carried himself with the dignity his parents had taught him. He remembered his father's words, "Don't ever let them take your pride, son. They can take your money, your title, but never let them take your dignity." Those words echoed with every accusation thrown at him, every attempt to paint him as the problem. The jury saw it too, the patience of a man who had been wronged, the injustice of an organization meant to serve but instead oppress. The case wasn't just about David anymore. Local news outlets began covering the story. Soon, it was national. People saw in David's fight a reflection of their own battles, against discrimination, against injustice, against the quiet erosion of dignity. The HOA had wanted silence, but instead they had sparked a movement, one that demanded accountability. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent. The jury found in David's favor, awarding him damages that ran into the millions. But the money, though significant, was not the true victory. The ruling was a public reckoning. It was a declaration that what had been done to him, and by extension, to so many others, was not just unfair, but unlawful. The HOA, once so confident in its authority, now faced financial ruin. Their insurance premiums skyrocketed, their reputation shattered, and their members turned on one another, blaming leadership for arrogance and misconduct. For years they had operated unchecked, believing their power to be absolute. But karma had arrived, not with vengeance, but with justice. David stood outside the courthouse, reporters' microphones surrounding him, cameras capturing his every word. But he didn't speak in anger. He spoke with grace. "This was never just about me," he said, his voice steady. "This was about every family that deserves to feel safe, respected, and free in their own home. Dignity isn't something you can fine away, and justice isn't something you can silence." His words carried far beyond that courthouse. Across the country, homeowners who had suffered quietly under discriminatory HOAs found inspiration. Legal experts pointed to his case as precedent. Communities began asking harder questions of their own associations. What began as one man's struggle had grown into a wider demand for fairness, for reform, for change. In the months that followed, David returned to his home, the home that had once felt like a nightmare but now stood as a symbol of resilience. His children played basketball in the driveway again. His wife tended her garden without fear of complaints. The laughter that once felt like defiance now rang freely, without restraint. The house, once under siege, had become a sanctuary again. But the story didn't end there. David used part of his settlement to establish a foundation dedicated to helping families facing housing discrimination. He spoke at universities, at town halls, at community centers, sharing his journey not as a tale of suffering, but of perseverance. His story became a reminder that injustice, no matter how deeply rooted, can be confronted, and that dignity, once defended, can ripple outward and inspire countless others. For the HOA, the consequences were lasting. Their attempt to force one man out had cost them not just millions of dollars, but their credibility. Many resigned, others faced lawsuits of their own, and the association that had once been feared became a cautionary tale. Their arrogance had been their downfall, their prejudice their undoing. David's story is not just about property lines or bylaws. It is about the unshakable truth that dignity cannot be stripped away by those who fear it. It is about the power of courage, the strength of standing firm when every system tells you to yield. And above all, it is about justice, not swift, not easy, but certain. In the end, the man they tried to silence became the voice of countless others. And the dream home they tried to turn into a nightmare became the stage where karma delivered its most powerful lesson.